Hello, we're here today to talk about the coronavirus crisis and the potential implications for extremism, and particularly extremism recruitment. So I'm joined today by John Coyne and Peta Lowe. John, I'll just get you to introduce yourself and give a bit of a detail about your background.
Thanks, Elise. My name's John Coyne. I am the head of the Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement Program at ASPI, but I've spent about 25 years working in the national intelligence community. Started my career really looking at right-wing extremists in terms of intelligence. Did a little bit of work attending a number of their meetings in places like southeast Queensland for a while there, and have an ongoing interest in counter-terrorism and CVE, and certainly in terms of the rise, or people's perceptions about the rise of right-wing extremism today.
Great, thank you, John. And Peter, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you do?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. So I'm Peta Lowe. I'm Principal Consultant with Phronesis Consulting and Training. I started my career some years ago in youth justice and worked primarily with juvenile offenders, and then more recently, over the last few years, have been working specifically with juvenile terrorism offenders. So my role has been in that organisation to assess and develop interventions for rehabilitation of terrorism offenders, but also more extensively to provide advice and guidance both to my own organisation and others in working with young people who are at risk of radicalising, working with vulnerable young people to prevent and divert young kids from that pathway, and working with community groups as well to try and identify what, I guess, responses we can have to crises like these to be able to prevent young people from being radicalised through to joining violent extremist groups and engaging in terrorist activity.
Fantastic. Thank you both for joining us today. My name is Elise Thomas, and I'm a researcher with the International Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI. And my work focuses on a range of different aspects of sort of online information and disinformation, including looking at conspiracy theorists and far-right extremists online. And so the reason we wanted to have this discussion today is because obviously the coronavirus crisis is going to have some really significant implications for terrorist recruitment strategies, and also for countering violent extremism, and some of the approaches and tactics which are appropriate and possible to use in that context. So maybe, John, I'll go to you first. So what are some of the risk factors, or especially dangerous times, or like indications of how this may be playing out in extremist circles that you'd be keeping an eye out for?
Look, there's the short game and the long game in terms of this, Elise and Peter. And from my perspective, what I see is two things. First off, in the short game, it's a really powerful way of harnessing fear, for whether you're a Salafi jihadist or whether you're a right-wing extremist. The idea of, and it doesn't even actually have to happen, the idea that you can spread COVID-19 and use it from a terrorism perspective. I think, though, the real issue for me is the medium-term game on this, which is on one side of the equation, you're going to have our young, our vulnerable people out of employment in Western liberal democracies especially, and they're going to be dissatisfied, disgruntled and disassociated from their normal social networks. On the other side of that equation is that there'll be a mixture of feelings in that, of fear, a sense of uncertainty that can be manipulated by other players. And by that, I mean, depending on who you are, Salafi jihadists or whether you're right-wing extremists, there's a real environment where you can blame the other. And if we're looking historically, you could look back to that period before World War II and the rise of Nazi Germany. You can sort of sit there and say, we're in the middle of this crisis, you're young, you're unemployed, it is this person or this group of people's fault for that change. And I think for me, those are the two issues that are really high risk. And usually, so as an intelligence or a national security person, I'd normally be turning around and saying to the priority is intelligence gathering, etc. Whilst it still has some truth, I think that right now, and it's why I'm glad to be on this panel with both of you. I think right now that the real thing is that alternative perspectives, the use of cyber, in your case, Elise, and the perspectives that you have, and Peter, your first-hand experiences as well with the narratives of the extremists, be they Muslim extremists or be they right-wing extremists. I think that this is that it's a critical time over the next 12 months. And if it's not handled particularly well from a policy perspective, we're going to find ourselves rapidly entering into a new age of terrorism with an upbeat tempo in terms of actual terrorist activity and those who've been radicalised.
Yeah, I very much agree, John. There is going to be how this plays out in extremist circles, I think, will differ in the short and long term. In the short term, obviously, you'll see exploitation of the crisis, but in the long term, the economic implications of this are likely to, for example, dramatically increase socioeconomic inequality. And with that, you could sort of drive narratives of sort of, grievance and dispossession, which we know link into various forms of extremism. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I tend to agree, John, that there are short-term and medium and more long-term implications of this. I think there are a few things that might play out in the relatively short term, and we know that we've seen that already, the increase in the number of internet users, which just provides an increase in an audience for a narrative that they potentially wouldn't have had before. The medium-term consequence, I mean, we're sending kids home from school. We know for young people in particular, school is a really protective factor. So we're now marginalising potentially vulnerable kids whose only real way of social interaction and connection was attending school, and they're now going to school from home. So we're just increasing the isolation, and we know there's two things that are required really for kids to be, drawn into a violent extremist narrative. One, social isolation, and the other is potential factors of vulnerability. And we've just put a larger group of kids in both of those circumstances, I think. And kids will naturally start to explore more things as they're at home on their own board. And those that maybe wouldn't have had an interest before may find themselves having an interest, which concerns me because, again, as you said, with the fear that tends to, everyone's uncertain at the moment, from the heads of countries all the way down to mums and dads. And that fear tends to drive those narratives that provide an explanation for something that might be appealing to someone. So I think we've increased the number of vulnerable kids. I think we've socially isolated them even further. And I think in the medium to long term, our real concern is going to be, how do we connect those kids back again? How do we stop the short term rapid increase in online use and the narratives that they're going to be exposed to? But in the longer term, how do we get those kids back into society? You know, the ones that were on the fringe who, there was only really school keeping them connected. What do we do about those young people in 6 to 12 months' time? How do you get them back?
Yeah, and I think that raises sorry, Peter.
No, yeah.
I think that raises a really interesting question, in that both a lot of terrorist and extremist recruitment and also a lot of CVE work are both going to have to move online in a way that maybe they haven't before. And I think there's a couple of interesting issues there. There's one which is sort of the impact of active recruitment. So I guess you have people who are already active in these groups who are going out and seeking to radicalise individuals, but there's also the issue of kind of passive radicalization, and that sort of plays into the YouTube rabbit holes. You start looking for one thing and you just start looking at more and more extreme content. That sort of algorithmic radicalization, which while you wouldn't want to suggest that it's the only factor, but it is a significant factor in radicalisation, particularly for people who are now spending hours and hours and hours online, potentially searching for content related to coronavirus. They very quickly end up down a conspiracy wormhole.
Yeah.
So how are the people you work with, Peter, trying to adapt their CVE approaches to having to work in a much more online environment?
Look, I think that's an interesting question. And there's always been an online CVE element. There's always been a component of CVE work that's online, challenging narratives and working on, trying to educate young people, particularly around being cyber savvy, like understanding those, as you say, rabbit holes, and how there really are echo chambers once you start, algorithms that allow you to continue to find information further and further down that rabbit hole. So educating around that. I think the challenge at the moment is that there's this real perception that coronavirus is the only threat to us currently. And I've noticed a lot of organisations that would normally be focused on the CVE work, focused on what does coronavirus mean for us, without necessarily connecting it to the risks that it poses for CVE work. So I think it is about, and that's why this is really timely and important, it's about reminding people that yes, coronavirus is a risk, but it also amplifies other risks. such as this one, what are our responses going to be? Because I haven't seen a lot of them that are as rapid as they potentially need to be, because we're not talking about an issue that's going to happen in 2 or 3 weeks. We're talking about kids currently now, as of 2 weeks ago, spending a lot more time at home. So our responses need to be as rapid as that. And I know that that's a tricky question, because lots of organisations are currently dealing with the risk to themselves as an organisation, to their staff, to the community. But we do need to have a response. How are we engaging young people in that conversation, and how can we engage more people who are involved in that conversation? So there are a lot of services going online. Is it that we start to get teachers more involved in that conversation because they're delivering classroom courses online? Should we be better training our kids helpline, lifeline staff members who are people are contacting in this crisis anyway? Should they be more aware of some of those conversations and risks as well? So it's an opportunity to say, who else can we involve in this CVE community, given that we are now moving very much online?
And Peter, look, I think that, I take all those points and I agree strongly with them, but I think that also there's an issue here where CVE has traditionally been focused on a stage of where people are out of trying to, they're already going along that sort of extremist sort of radicalisation process. I think we need to get far ahead of the curve than that. And I think COVID-19 and the movement of kids into schools, and this is almost like the antithesis of a national security practitioner, because I actually think that the key to dealing with this next CT challenge really is about preventing that growing sense of extremism and extremism thoughts. And it's even before, and I know we talk about algorithms, but I think this is really the critical component of it, which is getting in now before. And so let's use their right-wing extremist approach. So my experience over the last 3 decades is really right-wing extremism in Australia has really been cut off from growing extensively, because there really hasn't been much of a charismatic leader. Secondly, is that there's not been a central narrative. And Corona provides a central narrative and an audience for that narrative. So the audience are dissatisfied young people who are afraid and want someone to blame. And so you've all of a sudden got this environment. Now, it's more than just countering a narrative. It really is stopping people going along that journey well and truly before they even started. And that's about you being able to use and understand the technology, the algorithm. So it's part, and I really love the Australian Federal Police, in partnership with the private sector, developed that wonderful program around child exploitation, Think You Know. I think there's a component of that, and on the other side, I think there is still a component of we're going to have to ourselves proactively engage young people and at various ages in various mechanisms with engaging with and disproving, and not in a contrived sort of black and white way, but actually engaging intellectually with young people around these alternative perspectives and extreme ideals, and putting a really cognizant argument of why they are, despite their appeal, why they aren't backed by facts. So I think there's a lot of preemptive work that needs to be done now. It's almost unfamiliar space. Otherwise, what we are going to get is, I think in 12 to 18 months, maybe 2 years, a doubling, tripling. And I know, Peter, we've spoken about it before. I think that right-wing extremism growth in young people, and certainly in New South Wales, I think most people would agree has been on the expansional growth pattern for at least a couple of years now anyway.
I agree. And I think it's not just connecting with young people about this. It's not just focusing on young people. We have to engage parents and carers and, the other online community members now, what would have been normal community members, online community members in it, because we can't expect young people to make sensible decisions about that. They're just not going to. I mean, that's part of their developmental process. Is we need the people around them to be continually reminding them, advising them, supporting them, putting boundaries in place for them. And if as a parent, you don't know what your young person's up to online and you're not aware of the risks of that either. And, we do see it in the child sexual exploitation space, and we're having those conversations much more now. We should be extending those conversations. It's a risk for our kids, like any other risk, like being drawn into gang membership, like child sexual exploitation, like drug and alcohol use. It's a risk. We need to be starting to have those conversations with people about it so that they can be part of that solution as well. CVE should be done by everyone. And I agree with you. The earlier the easier. With anything, prevention is better than cure. So now is a really good time, I think, when parents are at home and children are at home together and connecting, to start having some of those conversations. But we need to skill parents to do that as well.
Look, I think so. Yeah, sorry, Elise.
I was just going to say, like, I agree with everything you're saying, but I also think it's a real mistake to focus only on young people. So one of the real sort of extremist risks that I think, certainly in Australia, we're not having enough of a conversation about is the risk from conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories like QAnon, conspiracy theories like sort of the New World Order, they are becoming more and more powerful, particularly online, and particularly amongst middle-aged to older audiences. They are actually getting a lot of traction. So, for example, today the FBI has charged a man who deliberately tried to derail a train in order to attract attention to a conspiracy theory that involved like the USS Mercy. It's a very sort of it's not really clear exactly what happened there, but we're at the point where people are derailing trains as a result of conspiracy theories. I think we really need to be paying much more attention to the risk from this kind of the rise of online conspiracy theories, particularly amongst middle-aged and older audiences as well. So I think it's a mistake to focus just on young people.
Look, yeah, Lisa, I can understand on that. I think that, and I guess as a middle-aged person who originates from Central...
You're so youthful, John. You're so youthful.
Yeah, thanks, mate. But my point is always that people do have a tendency of, and there are a lot of them out there who, have a tendency of believing what they read on the internet and what they read in social media, and this comes back to, and I think that in some ways millennials and Gen Zs are slightly better equipped, I would say, to be able to cut through some of that and some of the obvious things about, where, Facebook posts that say, about breaking news, etc., where it comes from, etc. I think they're better equipped. So there's definitely some education required in that space. But I don't think, in terms of CVE, I don't think it's anywhere near, and not the target audience necessarily of CVE programs. I think it's something very, very different.
But should it be?
Well,
why isn't it?
Look, you know what? I'd say two things on it. First off is that they're very different audiences that require very different approaches. And, I cut my teeth in my military intelligence career doing psychological operations. And I just remember, in terms of shaping behaviour, it's got to be very targeted. And I think that it's very, very different, the approaches you take between engaging a CVE program with young people and changing other behaviours. And I think it's very different between radicalisation, as in politically motivated or religiously motivated violence, versus misinformation programs. But, look at...
I think it's sort of I think, there are, if not, I think there are some certain echoes between conspiracy theories and certain kind of ideologies. And I also think, if you have someone deliberately derailing trains, the impacts of that are the same, regardless of whether they're a conspiracy theorist or a religious fanatic.
Well, I think depending on what the conspiracy is, and this is the other part, there was and I think you've quoted this to me in our conversation before, that example of the guy who turns up at a pizza shop believing a whole heap of children are locked away now in the basement. Now, that there's an element of violence involved, but is it terrorism? Is it extremism? Well, I'm not so convinced it is. And I think that they're not to say there isn't a role for government. I think that what we're talking about here is very different. I think that what we're talking about here is the widespread appeal of a political ideal. And ironically, we've been so fortunate in the past with, I use right-wing extremism because I think it's one of the ones, certainly for Australia, where we're most vulnerable over the next 12 to 18 months. I feel that, when you look at it, there's now a centralised message which these groups haven't had in the past. So this is the centralised message, and the audience are both there, and that combined creates a very different problem. There is a major problem, and people with COVID-19 are looking for someone to blame. you know, these sorts of things catch on quick, and that's very different from being brought on other ways. And I mean, I might add, and in Peter's answer before, we were on a panel together at a conference some time ago, and I think I was being mischievous, and I said that, you know, CVE had failed, and I taunted mercilessly backwards and forwards. We had this discussion, and I think now that since then, I think that I've been unfair on Peter in this, in the sense that, you know, CVE, you know, it's very hard, and Peter said before, it's very hard when someone has already converted to an extremist belief to bring them back. And the further along they're on that journey, the harder it is to bring them back. But I really believe that in terms of right-wing extremism and Salafi jihadism, the next 12 months we can really use what people generally bucket into the idea of CVE, but I think it's much, much earlier along the path. So, Peter, I am sorry.
Look, I love that you called it mischievousness. That's fun. It was a good conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to have. And look, working in the CVE space, I don't care what we call it, whether it's CVE, CT. I don't really see necessarily the clear distinctions of that other people do. And because that process of radicalisation, for want of a better word, but it's the word that's used, it is not clear and it's not straightforward, and no two pathways are the same. I've interviewed many people whose experience of radicalisation has been very different, and that includes adults. I've interviewed some adults recently around their process of radicalisation as well. For me, I don't think the age matters around that process as much as the factors contributing it. Yeah. The problem that the issue that I see with young people in particular is developmentally, they haven't formed those beliefs as much, and so there's a lot more opportunity for intervention really early. But also there are certain factors that make young people just that little bit more of a risk for me. So taking a person from believing something to acting violently as a result of it, you know, for an adult, that's really difficult to do because they've got a lifetime of narratives and stories and values and beliefs that say we shouldn't act violently, instrumentally, right? What we have with young people is an impulsivity that factors into that. And what we're seeing more and more in young people, and I can tell you through my career in youth justice, is an acceptance of violence generally. So you mix that with a narrative that gives them either a reason to be violent or explains how violence can be productive and useful for them, and they can actually get something from it, whether that's status or, you know, they can get some value from that violence. I think that for me is why I focus a lot on young people. That's not to say that adults aren't at risk as well. And I take your point, you know, that narrative around, particularly at the moment, what the right wing are doing in terms of collaborating around COVID and using it as a central kind of argument is speaking to many people, and many middle-aged people who are looking for something to explain the current uncertainty in the world. So I don't think it's necessarily an age of issue. For me, the focus is on young people because I see such opportunity. Also, I think when I interview even middle-aged men about beliefs, you know, and I say this a lot, when do you start to form a belief? People often ask me, when did someone start to radicalise? Well, how long's a piece of string? When did you start to believe that NRL is a better game than AFL? I use that example a lot. You can't pinpoint the day. You can probably tell me why, but you can't pinpoint the exact date and time. It's a combination of things you've been exposed to over your life. So even for the adults that I talk to, some of those roots or foundations of their current belief is in childhood and early adolescence. So I feel like that's a good opportunity for us, because if we don't intervene then, they're not necessarily going to address those thoughts themselves. They're just going to continue to reinforce that narrative. So it is a prime opportunity, even if they don't end up actually radicalising through to violent extremism until adulthood. I just feel like it's a really ripe time to do that really successful diversion work.
Yeah, so John, we can have this conversation another time. I'm not convinced. I will continue arguing.
I don't think there's a right answer either, I might add. I think that we're really, what we're trying to do here is try to find absolutes. And I mean, the minute you step into absolutes, you're always going to be challenged, because people being people. I just, my key focus, I should have been clear. I just think now is a time to focus on when I say young people too, I'm talking about, you know, 30 30s and younger. I think all things are relative too. So people who are young when you're 25 are much younger than when you're in your 40s, I think is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of meant that I'd argue much more for the case of like the conspiracy theory should be incorporated into CVE work, particularly because there is such a crossover now between elements of the far right and some of these conspiracy theories. But we can have that argument another time, because I'm aware that we're like a little bit short of time, and I just wanted to get onto the topic of surveillance, because I suspect that we're going to see around the world, including in Australia, a significant expansion of sort of various surveillance technologies, various surveillance legal powers related to health surveillance, related to surveillance of COVID-19. And I think particularly as this crisis continues to play out, and particularly as government budgets around the world start to get squeezed as well, there will be a temptation to expand surveillance in sort of counter-extremism contexts, as well as cutting back on some of the early prevention or CVE projects, and I think that would personally, I think that would be a huge mistake. In that, surveillance, like it's literally just watching the problem. It's not a prevention. It's not a solution. And so I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about how to how governments can sort of continue to actually address the problem as opposed to just watching it happening.
Look, I think there's a couple of points to raise with that. Surveillance is a wonderful tool for investigators and intelligence professionals working in the counter-terrorism environment. It's incredibly challenging. So most people in the public seem to think that those working in the national security apparatus want more information, and in reality they don't. They actually want more of the right information, less of the wrong information, and that's a really difficult thing to achieve. So it's secondly is I think that most, and it's always whenever I say extremes, I think you'd find 80% of intelligence and policing types, whether they're in the state and territory jurisdictions or the national jurisdictions, would say, "Oh, look, we're never going to arrest our way out of the CT problem." So they very much say that CVE is really important. I think it's incredibly difficult to measure success in terms of CVE. So what that means is that under any budget pressure, it's very hard to come up with hard and fast key performance measures to be able to prove that your budget's working. And certainly the way risk goes with, and I know that Peter will have a much better understanding of this and first-hand experience, but I'll finish off by saying in terms of risk is that it's incredibly difficult to take someone off. Say you've got say you've got a list of 400, 500 high-risk targets. Taking someone off that list as a key KPI for a CVE activity, or reducing the number of people who are radicalised and go onto the list, doesn't equate for the fact that by their nature, national security organisations and police are risk adverse. So they don't want to take people off the list just in case they do actually commit an attack down the track. So success is incredibly difficult to measure in terms of CVE. And despite the support from law enforcement, police, finding that what tangibly works is very difficult. And the other thing is that the public is unforgiving of governments and organisations that fail in the CT space. So if there's a successful CT, an attack, a terrorism attack, someone will hang, someone will be blamed, regardless, if you do your best job on the day that you possibly can. However, all that being said, for my money, I still think that it's the most effective dollar for dollar, good CVE projects. And I'm not sure that they can be, and again, Peter will have an opinion on this, I'm not sure they can be targeted at the, at the sort of, for want of a better term, enterprise level. So what works for some people doesn't work for everybody. So there's no such thing as a perfect program as well, which brings its own unique challenges. But certainly that, there will be a pressure to keep some surveillance powers because, police and national security organisations see them as valuable for investigations.
And I think you said it right there. I mean, surveillance is valuable for investigations. it's a tricky catch-22, because I agree with you. There is no appetite for risk in the CT space, unlike many other forms of offending, where you can release an offender or, reduce the risk of an offender or stop supervising an offender on parole. That offender might reoffend, and there might be some really, and we've seen it play out quite publicly, there might be some really violent, horrible offences. We still don't get the same reaction from the community or from all levels of government around how did we fail in that. The issue in the CT space is we don't have the same data set. We don't have the same evidence. We're not exactly sure what it is that we're measuring to say that was successful. And if, history has told us anything about rates of incarceration of people with violent extremist beliefs and how long it then takes them post-release to reoffend. I think we saw that post-Guantanamo Bay and, the operations of many of those people who were held in custody for a very long time. Sometimes you're looking at decades later that they actually will re-engage or act out their existing engagement in a violent extremist ideology. So we just don't know what the end of life on offending for a CT offender is. Nor do we really know when we're watching someone who we think might be radicalising, nor do we really know where they are on that pathway. So there are particular flags, surveillance flags, obviously, that they look for. But until you have a conversation with a person, how do you actually assess where they're at and what their intentions are and what their beliefs are and what they want to do? So I understand why it happens, and I certainly don't think we can not have it, but it has to be seen as part of the picture, because as you said, Elise, it doesn't do anything to manage or mitigate the risk at all. It reminds us constantly that the risk is there. So you can't just surveil someone and monitor them and know what they're saying, and that stops there from being any risk. We just know what it is at the time. We actually have to do some intervention. And so one of the issues that I have with how long do we surveil people, or how long are they on some sort of radar before we actually start to do some intervention? Because there is this tension between needing to collect information or evidence for investigative prosecutory purposes and actual CVE work, which would be, hang on a minute, we think this person, this individual might be on a pathway. How about we actually intervene? And I think we have to do a bit more of working together on that, because unless we're doing some work with that individual, there will always be the risk. And we're never going to get that right 100% of the time. That's the worst part about CT, is that we're going to miss things, because it's not a perfect science in terms of being able to say who will go on and do what. Human behaviour isn't a perfect science to begin with, but we don't understand enough about it just yet to be able to really, with any certainty, predict who will do what, when, where. So I think I agree that there will be a push to do more surveillance. I don't think that that's a bad thing, as long as that surveillance comes with some additional investment in the work that needs to go on around the individual, the communities, the families that you're surveilling at the time. Because unless we do that work, we're just going to continue to have to increase our surveillance budget every year, and it's untenable. And you cannot be looking at everyone all the time. That's the reality of it. And as people go online, you're going to be like, how do you look at what millions of people are doing every day? It's impossible to do. So we have to start identifying other areas where we can intervene and reduce the number of people that we may end up having to surveil. For me, there is a measure. If we do CVE really well, we don't need surveillance. If we actually engage really early and we do that prevention diversion work, we should see a reduction in our surveillance budgets, because they're not required. So whenever we're increasing our surveillance budget, CVE isn't working.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We could talk about this literally all day, but I think we're out of time. So thank you very much, Peta and John, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.